She's starting to record. Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of Lincoln Douglas Debate Camp at the George Mason Debate Institute. Today we have a special guest with us who's going to be discussing a specific philosophical debate over one of the potential national topics of whether or not societies ought to privilege public health emergencies over the ideas of protecting civil liberties when it comes to requiring or restraining public action. So he's going to be using several different philosophical perspectives to kind of introduce how those debates happen. So without further ado, I am going to turn the floor over to Dr. Ted Kinneman, who is an associate professor at George Mason in the philosophy department, a former Fulbright fellow, and has written several different articles specializing in Kantian perspectives, and at Mason teaches our theories of knowledge classes, history of modern philosophy classes, history of ethical theory classes, and specific classes about philosophical figures like Kant and Hume. So with that in mind, Dr. Kinneman, I will leave it in your very capable hands.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you. First of all, let me confirm everybody can hear me and see the slides that I'm sharing. I mean to be showing you some PowerPoint slides. Is that everything? All systems go on that front?
I can hear you. I cannot right now see the PowerPoint slides. I think you might have to go back in just sharing mode of that.
That better?
Yep.
All right. Well, anyway, good morning to all of you. I was pleased to hear about your topic. I was happy to pitch in and offer an hour of my time no matter what, but on your specific topic, I actually had been thinking in my planning an honors class I'm teaching in the fall of focusing on something like the issue that you're talking about in this part of your debate study, namely the tension, shall we say, between what public health requires and what is due to individual rights and civil liberties. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is going to be shaped a little bit about my thinking about my own course in the fall. There am I. I guess I didn't really need to give you a picture since I didn't really need to do this at all since you already introduced me. I guess one thing they get out of this that you didn't give them, Jackie, is that I'm a Nationals fan, but that's probably not essential for following what I want to tell you here. I also want to say I've just prepared some slides. I'm prepared to talk about some of the sort of big issues that I see as relevant from a philosophical perspective on this question. But I am happy to take questions or comments at any point. In fact, I'll be a little bit disappointed if it's just me talking and everyone sitting and listening. I hope you'll pipe up and ask questions and so on. All right. So now we see, right? Everyone sees the slides. Okay, so let's focus the discussion. And this is partly because this is how I was thinking of focusing a class I'm doing in the fall. Let's focus instead of the general topic of public health emergency and civil liberties, let's focus on the specific civil liberty, one's right, if there is one, to choose not to wear a mask in a pandemic. I am going to be assuming here, I'm assuming this, but I actually believe these assumptions are true. I'm going to assume that the virus poses an imminent danger. It's killing lots of people and making lots and lots and lots of people sick. And I'm also going to assume that if everyone wore masks in situations, when we're indoors or when we're in reasonably crowded places outdoors, that wearing a mask can reduce that danger. So for the sake of our consideration today, let's suppose that we're considering passing a law making it mandatory to wear masks anytime one is in a crowded public place, meaning crowded enough that it is impossible to, or very difficult to maintain the recommended 6 feet distance. Whoops, sorry. All right, so let's start with a deep philosophical question. Do I have an ethical obligation to wear a mask? Yes. You may have been expecting suspense on that point, but in fact, I think there is none. But that's on the ethical question about one's personal responsibility to other people. So everybody, please wear a mask. But even though I have an obligation, an ethical obligation to wear a mask, there's still a different question, my next deep philosophical question, as to whether I have a right to refuse to wear a mask. And the difference between these two questions brings out, this is the difficult question, so I'm not going to just offer a one-word answer to this one. And in fact, I think the point is rather difficult. Do I have a right to refuse to wear a mask? This brings out the gap between questions of ethics and questions of political or social right, legal right, for example. There are different ways of expressing it. So the fact is that in our society, in most societies, and in particular, and as a matter of principle, in liberal societies, not every obligation that people have to each other is enforced by society or enforced by law. So the example that I give you here, which is a pretty simple one, it is wrong, it is unethical to lie. But in cases of lying, I do not break the law by lying. If a political leader lies, even then, even if a political leader lies, there are only limited circumstances in which that can be breaking the law. And I should say that as philosophers talk about this sort of thing, I say the way I've put it here is not every obligation to other people is enforced by society. This does not mean only enforced by law. John Stuart Mill, for example, who I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, John Stuart Mill is very clear in emphasizing that the question he's interested in is not only one's right to be free from laws that can constrain individual behavior, but also to be free from coercive social pressure independently of the state and independently of any legal juridical coercion. Furthermore, a different distinction that on the face of it can seem similar, and this is in case you're, just to be clear about how a philosopher looks at this. When we talk about somebody's rights, we have to distinguish what rights the person ought to have, even what social or political legal rights they ought to have, and what rights they actually do have. So to illustrate this distinction, think about Rosa Parks. Here's probably the most famous picture most famous one I could find looking at doing a Google image search. Is a famous picture of Rosa Parks on the bus. And I hope you all know who Rosa Parks was. If you didn't, look her up. Did Rosa Parks have a right to sit at the front of the bus? Yes, of course she did. It's wrong to racially segregate public transportation the way was the case in Montgomery when she was, in the 1950s. Did she have a right to sit at the front of the bus? No, clearly not, because her juridical rights were determined by what the law said, and the law said she needed to obey the sign that said, "Sit at the back." Okay. So, as in many respects, philosophical consideration of issues about the role of the individual in relation to society have been shaped by the ancient Greek philosophers, in particular Plato. In this honors class I'm going to be doing coming up, I will be having the students read Plato's Republic, written about, give or take, about 300 BC. Plato's question in the Republic is about the nature of justice. And the way he uses the word justice is a little bit different than the way we use it today. He thinks that, and this is a matter of actually common usage in his language, the ancient Greek, he thinks that justice is a word that can be applied in the same sense both to societies and also to individuals. We can ask, what is it to be a just person? But also, what is it to be a just society or have a just law, and so on? He defends a view. He defends a view according to which to be just is to be ruled by knowledge. And I'm putting this in a way that's meant to be very general. To be a just person is to be ruled by your faculty of reason. And this implicates an account of the soul. Plato thinks of the individual as individual soul as having parts. He doesn't take for granted the idea of unity of the soul. He thinks there are parts of the human soul competing with each other, fighting with each other. We have the faculty of desire or appetite. We have the faculty of spirit, essentially the sort of the fighting element in our soul. And we have reason, which is our faculty for discerning the truth. And more particularly, reason discerns the truth about our long-term best interest. So a just person, according to Plato, is somebody in whom reason rules over desire. Because desire is just appetite. Desire is the wanting of things, and some things we want and we need. Some things we want and there's no harm in having them. Some things we want and we're better off not having them. Reason is the faculty that can tell the difference between things I want and need and things that I want and don't need, things that I want and really would be better off without. In a society, a just society is one in which we have rule by what he calls philosopher kings. Our term today is some sort of like a technocrat. That is, it's a term we use for somebody who's just got knowledge of how things ought to go, ruling things for the best. And the term technocrat is often used in a pejorative sense, in a way that implies the technocrat cares very little for how people feel about her who rules. And that is just what Plato thinks you have in a just society. You have somebody with the knowledge of what is in the long-term interest of the society as a whole. And if that means that somebody's individual desires are stifled for the good of the whole, then so be it. That's what's better for the health of society as such. Plato has a very interesting criticism of democracy. It's a really great discussion. When Plato criticizes forms of government, forms of society different than the one that he defends, he criticizes it by way of showing what sorts of people you have in that sort of society. And when he critiques democracy, what he critiques is the sort of people you get in a democracy. What you get, he says, are citizens who don't know the difference between what they need and what they merely desire. They don't know it, or they know it and they don't care. One way or another, in a democracy, what you care about is getting what you want. And you don't want people, if in a democracy, you don't want people telling you what's better for you, what's better for society, what your ethical obligations are. What you care about is what you want. Socrates thinks that Plato thinks this is just the sort of thing you expect in a democracy. People who are short-sighted and selfish, frankly. How are we doing so far? Oh, Ferguson Abigail.
Okay, Plato didn't support democracy because he thinks that voters would be like selfish and think about their desires over justice. How could he ensure that the leader of a country wouldn't be selfish or focus on his desires over what's just?
That's an excellent question, and it is a huge theme throughout the Republic. In the Republic, one of the issues that runs throughout the book is the question of how we teach our citizens, and in particular, how we teach our rulers. So, number one, he does not buy into any idea of the equality of citizens. He thinks when we value knowledge and we value justice, we've got to value the people who are given the natural gift of intelligence and perception and self-rule. And we've got to raise them in a way that helps them become the sort of citizens we need. Everybody, both the rulers and the non-rulers, are taught in a way that shapes their soul so that they recognize their role in society. And this is, maybe you've heard of the sort of tag word is the question about nature versus nurture. Plato is somebody who believes 100% and entirely in nurture. Well, I'm sorry about that. He's dead, so your chances of meeting him are slim. Abigail, and I take it your first name is Abigail. The interesting thing about Plato is, the way he puts it is this. I'm paraphrasing, so it's not the way he puts it, but it's kind of the gist of what he says. In a democracy, Plato points out, everyone gets to vote. In a democracy, everyone is equal, and everyone's voice and everyone's opinion counts equally. That includes stupid and ignorant people. Now, the question he would ask is, why in the world would we ever institute such a system where important governmental decisions are made by people who are utterly ignorant of how to make important governmental decisions? That's precisely what you get in a democracy. As I was opening this document, getting ready to talk to you guys, I was thinking it would be fun as a way of understanding Plato's perspective to post something I saw just recently. I don't know if you know who Dr. Anthony Fauci is, but he's kind of the federal government's leading person, the NIH, the National Institute of Health's leading person on epidemiology. And he was testifying in Congress, and a Senator, Rand Paul, really went after him pretty doggedly about the rule of experts. Well, Fauci is just the sort of person who Plato thinks ought to be in charge of making decisions and not having to take impertinent questions from people like Rand Paul, who, whatever else they may know, are not epidemiologists. So, what do you think of them apples, Abigail? All right. Let me. I've already moved on. Next, let me talk about a completely different, much more recent philosopher. I say much more recent. The book that I'm mentioning here, On Liberty, was published in 1859, which I know might seem like a while ago to you, but from a philosopher's perspective, it's actually quite recent and very much in a context similar to our own in the United States in the 21st century. Mill was a British philosopher in the middle of the 19th century. And his very thin, very accessible book On Liberty has a huge influence on American law. So he's interesting philosophically, and for his influence really on the American legal system and for American legal thought as well. Mill defended what is called the harm principle, which is the principle, to put it in the most colloquial fashion, that a person ought to be free to do whatever she wants as long as she's not harming someone else. Now, a natural and important question to ask is, what constitutes harm, and under what circumstance? There's a lot of vagueness in that formulation. The way he puts it somewhat more specifically, he changes from a formulation in terms of harm to a formulation in terms of rights. So I ought to be able to do whatever I want, as long as I'm not violating the rights of someone else. So, okay, now the question is, what rights do I have? Mill's answer is that the rights I have are the distinct and assignable obligations that others have to me. Clear. I have clear and assignable here. That's actually not correct. It's distinct and assignable. Let me go correct that right now. Now, okay. Well, the phrase he uses is distinct and assignable. Sorry about that. Anyway, the idea is this. A distinct and assignable obligation is one that I owe to a specific person, a nameable person, and it's limited in a way that makes it not a general kind of obligation. So an assignable obligation means it's an obligation to or on behalf of a specific person. A distinct obligation means it is a well-defined, suitably narrow obligation. I do not, for example, have an obligation to live as I ought. Mill thinks there's a truth about how I ought to live, and there's a truth about what my ethical obligations are. There's a truth about whether there's a God and whether God gave us the 10 Commandments, so on and so forth. He thinks there's a truth about these things, but I do not have an obligation to live as I ought. I don't have an obligation to act on my own interest. I certainly don't have an obligation to act for your interest. And Mill is quite clear. Mill is quite clear that this entails that we're in a just society. We will be allowing people to do things that are harmful to themselves. He is absolutely against paternalistic legislation, paternalistic social action. He also thinks he is absolutely against requiring people to act for the public good. Each person pursues his own good. I saw a quote that now I'm trying to remember where exactly it came from. It did not come from On Liberty, but it was something to the effect that men are men before they are farmers or physicians. And if you teach them to be sensible, they will be sensible farmers and physicians. And the point there is, unlike Plato, he says men are men before they are farmers and physicians. So Plato denies that. And he also thinks you just need to sort of give people enough education so they can be sensible, know their own best interest. And as people pursue their own best interest, generally speaking, things in our society will work out. So unlike Plato, in contrast to Plato, this is a characteristically, really classically liberal view, because it involves giving people a very high degree of freedom to manage their own affairs. Yes?
So he talks about how you can basically do whatever you want as long as you don't violate other people's rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how would you tell whose right you're violating? Like for example, that one court case a few years ago with the gay couple and the baker, right? The gay couple has the right to not be discriminated based on their sexual orientation, while the baker has freedom of religion. How would you decide whose right is violating whose right?
Um, I um, I won't actually answer that question because it can be a difficult legal and philosophical question. I could speculate about how we might answer it. My sympathies are mostly with the couple, but that's different than having a philosophical conviction. The important thing is, from Mill's perspective, that the question about the baker and the gay couple would be for Mill a question about distinct and assignable obligations. So, for example, the legal principle that came into play in the particular case that you mentioned was a principle that also comes into play about in discussions about legal discussions about racial discrimination, because a similar or kind of parallel argument was made about racial discrimination. I'm a white store owner. This is my private property. I want the black people to sit at this end of the counter and the white people to sit at that end of the counter. But the ruling was from early on that, I believe it's called the public facilities principle, that opening a store is opening a public facility, and thus you're subject to obligations that you have not merely as a private member of society, but also as a member of the public, and that to forego that obligation, you would also have to forego offering a business in public. So the question became, on that particular case, maybe since you know about it, you remember the name of the case, and I don't offhand. The question became in that case, where are the distinct and assignable obligations, and which might override others? Thank you. Yes, well, that's an. I hadn't remembered that, Nicole. Again, it's not. My role here today isn't to get too tangled up in the particulars of this case, so much as to show you how Mill would look at this case. And as I say, his question would be, whose rights are being violated, and that question is answered by looking at distinct and assignable obligations. The paradigm case of a distinct and assignable obligation is a contract. Of course, not all our obligations are determined in explicit contracts, but the paradigm case is just one where, for example, I have a contract with George Mason University to do certain things as a condition of my job. I want to make the point on this slide here that Mill defends this view on the basis of the claim that it makes society happier overall. His ethical theory is what's known as utilitarianism. That action is the right one that produces the greatest possible balance of pleasure over pain. And so Mill has the interesting position that even if, let's say, my refusing to wear a mask causes some pain, when we take a step back and ask about the general social policy of requiring people to wear masks even when they don't want to, that policy conduces to the greatest possible balance of pleasure over pain, even though the individual case, my not wearing a health-promoting mask in a deadly pandemic, even though that particular case is one where my action causes harm. So again, there's this gap between my ethical obligations, and on the basis of utilitarianism, you'd have to say clearly I have an ethical obligation to wear a mask. The pain caused to me by wearing a mask is vastly outweighed by the pain that would come to others if they got the coronavirus. Okay, finally, this is an ethical thinker, but I'm also going to be talking about, it's distinguishing between the ethical and the political, but let me nevertheless draw a connection here with the thought of Immanuel Kant. His formulation of the supreme moral principle. If you get one thing out of this talk, remember the phrase categorical imperative. Maybe some of you know about it already. Kant, unlike Mill, saw not pleasure or happiness, but rather universality as the essential element in ethical reflection. To put it in the simplest possible terms, for Kant, the central ethical question is, what if everyone did that? And so his first formulation of the supreme moral law, the categorical imperative, is telling us, notice it's in the imperative form, act as though the maxim of your action were to become a universal law of nature. And the phrase maxim of your action there just means imagine that what you're going to do, everyone did under relevantly similar circumstances. So that question is a question about universality. If it's right for me to do it, it must be right for everyone to do it in similar circumstances, in, as I say, relevantly similar circumstances. In a way, for Kant, the central moral error is to make an exception of oneself. This might end up being relevant, for example, in the debate that I guess you're on a different topic that you're going to be engaging in about voting. So voting for Kant is going to be tied to the question of not just whether I ought to vote, because in a country of 330 million, one can reasonably say, my vote doesn't matter. And the fact is, in a really strict sense, that's true. But the ethical question Kant wants us to grasp is, what if everyone who just didn't feel like getting to the polling place or mailing in a ballot, what if everyone just decided voting isn't worth the trouble? Then no one would vote, or few people would vote. And then there's a long story to be told about the reasoning that takes place pursuant to that. But the point is, from Kant's perspective, that's the question you have to ask. What if everyone did that? This is connected for Kant to an idea of consent. In reasoning from a universal standpoint, as Kant thinks I ought to do in all ethical reflection, it is incumbent on me to recognize that just as I value my own freedom, I ought to value your freedom as well. For Kant, the ethics of suicide are exactly the same as the ethics of murder, because I need to treat myself just the way I treat other people and vice versa. So killing myself is on the exact same ethical footing as murdering someone else. So thus universality is connected to consent. I want my views, my reasoning power, my autonomy, to use Kant's term, my autonomy respected. And thus, if I am going to reason universally, not make an exception of myself, I need to value your autonomy as well. And the way Kant puts this is that I ought to act only so as to treat others as ends in themselves, that is, as rational beings with value unto themselves, and never merely as a means. And so we get the ideas of autonomy, we get the idea of exploitation. This is a principle against exploitation. And we get the idea of consent. More particularly, we get the idea of ideal consent, because Kant's view, and this is important in the present context, Kant's view opens up the possibility that we can say somebody, we can treat somebody in a particular way because we can establish that they are acting irrationally. Children, for example, and Mill would agree with the next point, children are taken to be, from the law's perspective, irrational, not capable of making good decisions for themselves. People with Alzheimer's, if you have a parent or some other older loved one who is experiencing dementia, one of the things that their families have to wrestle with is the extent to which they get to continue making decisions, financial decisions, legal decisions, medical decisions on their own. Unfortunately, I have experience with this, and I can tell you that when elderly adults with dementia lose their power of attorney over medical, financial, legal affairs, they often go kicking and screaming. They don't want to have their ability to drive removed. They don't want that. But in general, as a society, we recognize the possibility that they may have lost the capacity for rationality, so that we violate their actual consent in favor of their what's called their ideal consent. Ideal meaning in the idea, theoretical consent. And that is an idea that has its basis in this idea of treating people as ends in themselves. So sorry about that. I had to finish my thought. What did you want to ask, Nicole?
So my question was just, how would they resolve if two rational people just had different ethics? Like, for example, a Christian would think that premarital sex is immoral, but an atheist would not. But if they're both rational people, then how would that work under this philosophy?
Kant takes it for granted, actually virtually all philosophers take it for granted, that there is a moral truth. That is to say, when Nicole disagrees with Ted, at least one of us is wrong. Okay. There might be, in fact, there routinely is some difficulty in knowing which person is wrong. Possibly both are. I mean, if we're talking about a question that's formulated so that we actually have a question, at least one person is wrong. Noel thinks, in particular, makes a point of emphasizing that it can be very difficult to know who is wrong. But Kant thinks, I mean, his notion of rationality, because this is what you were actually asking about more specifically, his notion of rationality is such that there's supposed to be only one genuinely rational way of looking at a situation. That can seem implausible, I know, especially if you haven't studied a lot of philosophy, but is based in the idea that there is a moral truth. That is, he would reject the idea of what philosophers call relativism, that, you know, there's a truth for you and a truth for me. There is a moral truth, and our reason, in a certain very broad sense that goes back to Plato, our faculty of reason is our faculty of determining the truth. So if there's one truth, then, and you and I disagree about what it is, then at least one of us is wrong. At least one of us is being more rational than the other. And how we determine which of us that is a matter for public debate, giving of reasons and arguments, just the kind of thing you're learning to do so fabulously in debate. So I know that's kind of a non-answer, but that's actually the non-answer here. That it is, although it can be difficult to know in the situation you were describing who's closer to the truth, the assumption is that somebody is, and that's why we reason and talk and debate and formulate laws and criticize them, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So to sum up, just for the sake of clarity, what would each of these views entail about the question that I posed at the beginning of the slides, the beginning of the presentation? Well, first of all, Plato would look at this, and as I say here, he would snort and say, that figures. This sort of selfish, harmful, antisocial behavior is exactly the sort of thing you would predict in a democracy. Because in democracies, people are selfish and foolish and irrational. They are driven by their desires. Plato has no compunctions at all. I mean, he thinks that one of the advantages of a non-democratic rule by philosopher kings is we could have a philosopher king who says, I don't care about your feelings, I don't care about your desires. Our society requires people to wear masks, and so you must wear a mask. Mill, as I say, has this interesting position and a classically, characteristically liberal position that admits there can be cases where somebody's selfish, foolish behavior, or just plain immoral behavior, could be harmful, could produce more pain than pleasure. But he thinks that overall, letting people make their own decisions will end up working out for the good. So allowing foolishness, selfishness, self-destructiveness in the short term or on the small scale results in the longer term on the larger scale with maximizing the good of society. And Kant, who is also a liberal, he's a different kind of liberal from Mill. It's a very different foundation in philosophy, but he's also got a liberal view. Kant, too, both Mill and Kant would say as a matter of ethics, it's wrong not to mask. Kant's theory offers a possible basis for a law that would require one to wear a mask in public places. Namely, it would, and this is directly in the teeth of the possibility that Nicole was raising a couple of minutes ago. We would need to look from a social perspective and say, look, this guy who's not wearing a mask in a public place, he's behaving irrationally. Yes, he wants to be free of a mask, but for Kant, your mere wanting something by itself it's not that it has zero importance, but it definitely does not have overriding importance. For Kant, your desire not to wear a mask needs to be weighed against the interests of the other people. Could you, from a suitably universal perspective, will that nobody wears a mask? And on the plausible assumption that, in fact, everyone is fully informed and given cognizance of all the relevant facts about the disease, about preventing the disease, about the state of their fellow citizens, everybody, given all the relevant facts and given full rationality, would say, well, I want other people to wear masks. I'm happy not to wear a mask, but only on the assumption that other people do wear masks. And if that's right, then there's an argument based on universality but still on the basis of consent and autonomy to require people to wear masks even if they don't want to. So here endeth the presentation.
Does anyone have questions for Dr. Kinneman?
Abigail.
Out of Plato, Mill, and Kant, who would you say that you agree with most?
Out of Plato, Mill, and Kant, the one I agree with most personally, I guess, is Kant. I use all of these texts regularly in courses I teach, and I never use a text in a course unless I think there's real force to the philosopher's view. I never teach anything that I think is just garbage, that I think is just wrong. I see Rand Paul arguing with Anthony Fauci, and I think, well, of course, listen to the guy. He knows you don't. And Mill is basically the philosopher of the American Civil Liberties Union, and to use an old phrase from American politics, I am a card-carrying member of the American Civil Liberties Union. But I'm a student of Kant, and I find his emphasis on autonomy and rationality and universality to be fruitful as a way of understanding, well, liberalism, basically liberalism in the broad sense, not in the Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden sense, but in the sense of how we structure a free society. Anyone else? Yes, Nicole.
So I'm assuming that when you bring up Plato, when he says that he would snort and say this is just the type of behavior you would expect in a democracy, would he would he would he agree with Mill or Kant? Because I'm thinking that he thinks it's wrong not to wear a mask, like both of them say, but I'm not really sure which side he would take.
Plato?
Yeah.
So both Mill and Kant are, in the philosophical sense, liberals, meaning they value freedom. Plato is just not a liberal and not a Democrat. What people want to do, what people choose freely to do, just doesn't matter that much in Plato's view. What he wants to know is, is what you want to do something good, something that helps our society flourish? And on the assumptions that I think are true, but nevertheless, the assumptions that I just stipulated at the beginning of my presentation here, not wearing a mask in a pandemic is not good for society. So for him, I mean, the ethical question would be pretty simple. But again, there are different values in play here. He just doesn't care about freedom or desire or your wants. Am I getting at your question? I mean, it's a fundamentally different worldview and political view from Mill and Kant. Though Mill and Kant disagree about some things, they both value freedom in a in a way that puts it right at the basis of their views, and Plato does not.
All right, I think that's the time that we have for questions. So if everyone wants to give Dr. Kinneman a virtual round of applause.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Fun talking to you.
All right, I hope you have a very safe and relaxing rest of your summer.
Yep, and if feel free to email if you if you want to ask me any questions or follow up on anything. I'm easily reachable through George Mason email. So have a good summer. Bye now.
Bye. So for everyone in the class, we'll take our 10-minute break now. And when you join us back, you can enter the course room, not this room, and we'll stay in the course room for the rest of class. Thank you so much for not typing Stan Immanuel Kant for clear skin during that lecture, because I was really worried it was going to happen. Glad that you thought about it before doing it. So I'm glad that you all kind of heard that, though, because it gives you a little perspective of where professors of the field kind of fall. I thought the questions you all asked were really good. So great participation so far during classes. Let's come back at 11:11, since I just took a minute of your time, given a little finalization of that, and I'll see you in 10 minutes.